Let me ask you a legitimate question. Whatever happened to the vampire genre? Back in the 1980s, the vampire genre was in desperate need of a modern makeover. By that time, the majority of horror movies that came out were slasher movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. With movies like The Lost Boys and Fright Night, the vampire film genre had a modern look to moviegoers but were still true to what their strengths and weaknesses were. But by the early 90s, the vampire genre started to go downhill. The crappy film that got a cult following was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This movie depicted vampires being stupid and disposable henchmen. It was so popular that it got its own TV show and a spin-off show. In the mid-90s, there was a film adaptation of Interview with the Vampire. This film didn't help either because it made vampires weak by having them be able to kill by getting their heads cut off. Then came the Blade films. This was like the Buffy movie except minus the camp and butchering up the vampire genre to a whole new level. They gave them more weaknesses and made silver a weakness. A vampire is not really interesting or intimidating if you give him more weaknesses and strengths. By the new millennium, you thought the vampire genre would bounce back. In fact, by this point the Blade movies were starting to go downhill. But by the mid-2000s there came an abomination called the Twilight Books that spawned a whole series and probably the worst film series of all time. Now, why do I hate Twilight and why do I consider the breaking point of the vampire genre? First off, vampires do not sparkle. If they hit the sunlight, they burn. Second, they made them complete wimps by taking away a lot of their powers and having them drink blood from animals. Third, why do people think that vampires can read minds? On a side note, Bella is probably one of the worst role models of all time. But not only are the vampires ruined, but the werewolves get ruined too. I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan, but I recalled in the third film that they explain the differences between a werewolf and an animorph. A werewolf is someone who can turn into a wolf without their control, but an animorph is someone who changes into an animal with their own will. So technically these aren't werewolves, they're animorphs. But even if they were werewolves, this is probably the worst werewolf design that I've ever seen. It's so lazy looking because it's just a huge wolf, and on top of that the CGI is so obvious. By this point, vampires are either disposable henchmen in the Blade films, sparkly metrosexuals in Twilight, or complete mindless animals in 30 Days of Night. So basically, is there any hope? And the answer to that is, yes, there is hope for the vampire genre. Now that the Twilight movies are over with, the vampire genre is slowly going back on the right track. There's a new TV show coming out called Dracula. It's going to be on NBC, and next year Universal Studios is going to make another Dracula movie. So there is still hope.